This is The Balanced Dilemma. We tackle the often uniquely, but not always, female dilemma, managing life, work, family, and self. I'm Maura, Carlin.
And I'm Christie, Derrico. At The Balanced Dilemma, we speak with women and men to hear their balanced stories. Our guests are entrepreneurs, reinventors, creators, parents, and partners, telling us what we really want to know. How the heck did they manage that? And can you have it all and all at the same time?
How many of us would like a break? And not a Kit Kat bar or Snickers break, but a true pause on what you're doing. To stop and reflect on what you're doing and why. Consider how you want to go forward. Well, it's a great topic for the new year, and our guest, Rachael O'Meara, gave herself the gift of a pause. It altered the course of her life and career. In her book, Pause, Harnessing the Life-Changing Power of Giving Yourself a Break, Rachael shares her story and advice on how we can all pause without breaking our careers or the bank. Welcome to The Balanced Dilemma, Rachael. Thank you for joining us.
It's great to be here, everyone. Thanks, Christie and Maura. Love it.
So, Rachael, why don't you start us off with a little bit about your personal story? Tell us about yourself.
Sure. So I would consider myself a recovering achiever, probably like many of us listening in the audience, where I was really great at achieving things my whole life. I was a national champion rower. I was working at Google. I lived in New York. I lived in San Francisco, all these great things, yet I actually felt very defeated at work. This was when I was working at Google over 10 years ago, and I literally burned myself out. And long story short, I now am an executive coach who I help other women and other leaders help themselves get out of burnout so that they can rise to their next level of leadership. And that's what I do now.
That's a pretty good, succinct bio. You've also given a TED Talk and have been featured in prominent news publications like the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal.
And your book was one of the top business career books in 2017. So congratulations.
Right.
Pat yourself on the back. So,
thank you. Yes. Come a long way. Yeah. Thank you so much.
And it's a story to be followed. So let's rewind the clock a little bit. Did you always want to be a businesswoman when you were a little girl? Is that what you envisioned yourself doing?
Heck no. I had parents. My dad was an engineer and more of a science person, physics guy. My mom was a guidance counselor. So to me, my world was really about teaching and computers. But I don't think it was an accident. I did end up in technology where I started out in the telecom industry when the internet was just coming out, and from there went into the internet because that was way more exciting for me. So that led me to the business world. And I did minor in business in university, so that was good too.
Was there any mentor that you looked to when you were younger that you said, I want to be like that woman or man?
I didn't have a big mentor other than Wonder Woman on TV, honestly.
You just gave away one of my passwords.
Christie. I have a Wonder Woman cookie jar.
We probably all have it. But, like probably a lot of young girls, I had good teachers and people who instilled concepts that, I learned about in science. I was a big earth science person, and my dad did help me a lot with that. So I was always looking up at the stars, studying the planets, and figuring out, like, when the solstice was and that kind of thing. But, I feel like I really forged my own path because I figured a lot out by myself because I just did, I guess. I don't know.
You were also a high-level athlete in rowing. How, if at all, did that impact your career trajectory?
Yeah, I would say sports has always been a part of my life. So I played soccer, I was a figure skater, and then I graduated to rowing, if you will. And it always really helped me with discipline, I would say, where I felt committed to what my cause was, no matter what the sport was. And it taught me how to really train my brain and my body to be towards a certain achievement or a goal. So it wasn't just these academic things I was doing. It was actually more on the physical level. And that's really, to my core, I think, what I bring forward now as an adult. And that's a lot of fun for me, which is one of the big lessons I've learned. Because if we're not doing things that are fun, like, what's the point?
But did it also teach you to never give up?
I think so. Yeah, that's a good way to say it. Where in rowing, it's a hard sport, and I know, Christie, you know this.
Yes.
And you're literally like in a boat going backwards. You can't get out. You can't quit. You can't like jump out and swim to shore unless you really wanted to. So you're in there, and so you have to mentally be all in. And to me, you can't give up in that sense. You have to keep going, which is, I think, a big part of my work now is helping people keep going in their life and moving forward to their next level. And we're always going to our next levels, no matter where we are and what we're doing in our worlds. There's always more, which is so exciting to me.
So, in your book, I really found the story that you told of your personal failure at work and being told that you lacked executive presence. I found that really compelling, and I just personalized how you must have felt in receiving that information. How did that make you feel, and how did that bring you to where you are today?
Yeah, it was that self-defeating word comes up again for me. I really felt like a failure because here I was doing all these incredible things in my life, right? I ticked the boxes on so many things, yet I didn't have executive presence. I wasn't a strong communicator. I couldn't get my ideas across. And what was going on? Because it had worked up until that point. And so for me, I felt very compelled to do something that would feel more aligned. And that's why I took a pause, because I didn't realize that all of those things were taking a toll on me mentally and emotionally, because I just felt like I was in a mental tailspin all the time because, if I don't have this stuff at Google or anywhere for that matter, like what's going on? And for the life of me, I didn't know.
So did you feel like the failure led to burnout or vice versa, that the burnout led to the failure?
So here's what I think happened looking back. I really wasn't present. And what I mean by that is I was always in my head. I was thinking about the future, the 10 things on my to-do list, or the past. Like, I wish I'd said this in the meeting, or why didn't I speak up more? And to me, those were the things that were keeping me out of the present moment, and that's why I burned out, because I wasn't aware of how I was feeling, how I could communicate better and be more in relationship with others and all of that.
Do you think that this was tech-related, gender-related, a combination, or it would have happened no matter what you were doing?
I'm going to go with C. It would have happened no matter what I was doing. Because here's the thing, and I this is what I help other corporate people with, is that we are in our own environments and we're not aware of what we don't know. So that great phrase, what got you here won't get you there, I think is a big part of why 1 out of 3 people are now burning out, because we're not aware of what we know we might need. And we all need support, and we all need to know, okay, maybe here's a boundary I could put in place that will help me. Or maybe I should actually tell someone I'm feeling really frustrated. Those are the things that I had no clue, and it didn't occur to me. And it wouldn't have mattered if I was in tech, or I was in a doctor's office, or in a law firm. All that stuff is personal behavior that I've now learned. And the good part is they're all skills we can learn, which is great.
Rachel, can you describe what is burnout? Everyone uses the term, but I'm not sure we all really understand what it means.
Yeah. So burnout is actually defined by the World Health Organization as a possible epidemic. It's changing its definition as we speak, because our world is no longer sustainable. So the burnout is actually comprised of 3 things. One is the mental acuity that you need to do your job and focus and things like that, and the stamina. It's also it's a chronic issue where you might feel depressed or sad or just not motivated. And then it's also a behavioral aspect where it's an awareness. So knowing how am I doing to feeling sustained and engaged so that I can feel like I am not burning out. So I can feel like I'm doing okay in doing what I need to do.
So on this show, we have been a little bit fixated on the word pivot. But you talk about, the title of your book is Pause. What's the difference between a pause and a pivot or a career break?
I love that you've associated with that. And pivot's a great word. In fact, I talk about pivoting in my book because there's a great book called Pivot by Jenny Blake, and she's a pause story in my book. But to me, pivoting is like just like the basketball player, you got one foot on the ground, you got one foot pivoting around in different ways to look and scan for different things, to potentially like pass the ball, do something different. To me, a pause is an intentional shift in behavior. It's literally an intentional shift, meaning you have to be self-aware. You have to be conscious and off of autopilot. So I think they go together, but I feel like the pausing is a more umbrella term.
You're listening to The Balanced Dilemma. We're speaking with Rachael O'Meara about taking a pause. Rachael, when we took our break, you had explained the difference between a pause and a pivot. What about between a pause and a career break? And I just want to note that LinkedIn recently put in a section where you could say you're on a career break. And I'm wondering, where that fits into what you're doing.
Yes, I'm so excited that LinkedIn did that, because I think of this as a career break can be a pause. I call it a long pause. Let's say you might take 3 weeks off or something. It might be 3 months. And the good news is we have discretion on what we can choose to take sometimes, whether it's even just using your vacation days. But if it's a longer break like that, I think it was a long pause. And there are many different types of pausing, and up to micro pauses, like within our day that take seconds. But a career pause can be a really important thing, I think, if you need that longer transition to really assess, okay, what's going on here? In my world, I did a 90-day unpaid break, but sometimes it's necessary, and sometimes you actually don't need it if you actually can learn the skills to get out of burnout before you hit that wall, before you hit that area that feels like it's too much.
And just so we can cover this issue, LinkedIn's new option to explain gaps in careers and things like that, do you think that's a good thing to talk about, your break or your pause, or is it something that maybe you should keep to yourself? How do you feel about that?
I think, well, it's all going to be about your own personal comfort, but my recommendation is get outside your comfort zone. Start talking about it, because you're only going to become more affirmed in your own position, and it's becoming more normalized. If we can all share a little more about what we're doing, there's not going to be the stigma attached, or you thinking like you're a slacker if you take the pause. To me, those are the things that have been in the way and a hindrance for people to do things that might really serve them for their whole lives, not just their career, but for everything.
That's a really good point. It's like the way we've found men taking paternity leave is normalizing maternity leave for women, not just men exercising their rights. But we want to get to the 3 pause dials. Tell us, these are money, time frame, and Maura, the third
is activity. So let's start with, let's start with money. What do you mean by that? Because obviously,
money.
Yeah, we all need it.
So think of it like you've got a dashboard in front of you, right? And you've got these 3 dials. Money is a variable. You can have no money, like $0 for a pause. You might take a breath, right? Like right now, if you take a deep breath with me, inhaling through your nose and exhaling, like how much did that cost, right? That was free. Or you might have $1 million, right? I mean, there's a whole spectrum. So there's the money aspect. That's one thing you could have and decide how you want to use it. And then you've got these other 2 dials, which are time frames. So again, it could be a micro pause, like a breath, or maybe it's one of those career pauses that's a little longer. And then the 3rd dial, activity, means you get to choose, meaning do what works for you. What kind of pause going to be up your alley? So maybe it's a walk in nature every Tuesday at 3 o'clock. Just depends.
So go ahead, Christie.
So if I understand you correctly, you highlight these 3 pause dials. So you are advocating for an analysis of what level of pause you need, how you're going to fund it, and how you're going to implement it. Is that how these 3 dials work?
Yep. So you can structure your pause to meet your needs. So a lot of times people think, I can't afford to take time off. Like, forget that. And that's a luxury, right? Only 11% of companies offer any type of unpaid leave. By the way, in the global world, 4% offer paid leave. So that's a rarity. But that's why you have the flexibility. A lot of times we cut ourselves off because we think we can't afford it, or we don't have the time, or we don't have the resources. And the reality is, you do have the time. You just have to create it. Maybe it's just that breath. Maybe you decide, I'm going to take 10 mindful breaths every day. And you start there, or 3.
Is that day or an hour really enough to give you a pause?
In your experience?
Yeah, there's no perfect answer, honestly. But we all got to start somewhere. And if it feels like it's too much to do something big, then how can a little one not be a good start, in my opinion? So you start wherever you're at. You start with the breath, if that's where you're at, and you can only do that. Or maybe you start journaling. That's another pause, right? I'm a big fan of journaling. And you start writing down in 6 months, like, here's what I see myself doing. Or in 3 months, here's what I see myself doing. And you start with that. And I think it's all about what works for you. I mean, that's a really critical core principle of pausing. An intentional shift in behavior is about what works for you. It's not about the cookie cutter recipe that everyone else is doing, because you're going to know what your unique needs are. And that's the whole presence part. That's the whole self-awareness part that we can all think about and can really shift.
So on
what we're doing and how we show up.
On that third dial of activity, and let's say you're taking a longer pause, do you need to plan in advance what you're going to do with that time?
Great question. I like to think about it like you can plan it in the broad brushstroke. So having a vague idea, right? So maybe you have a time frame already set, but the activity, you're like, well, I find passion and joy in gardening, let's say, right? So it's about, this is why it works for you. So you decide, what is it that brings you joy, or what things do you get passionate about? And from there, you could figure out the broad brushstrokes. Okay, I know I want to keep that up. I've been saying for 5 years that I want to build a garden, and I didn't. So I'm going to do that. Like, that's what my pause will be, is working in the garden for 20 minutes, 3 days a week. But I think it depends on what that might be for you. But then leave room for the magic. Like, that's the part of this that I think is important, too, in the activities, is that if you have every single detail planned, to me, that's a lot of control that doesn't leave a lot of room for knowing the unknown.
So this is kind of like giving yourself space.
Exactly. Giving yourself permission for space.
And what's interesting with this plan not to plan, some people find it very hard to achieve these little pauses that you're describing, the time for journaling.
Yeah.
And we've discussed here carving out time in your schedule, making it like a doctor's appointment. How did that work for you? I mean, you took actually a sabbatical, but your life changed after that leave. And how did you continue to incorporate pause in a very busy lifestyle?
Yeah. So the part of it is when you're in a pause, whether it's a day or a year, you're in the unknown because you don't have it all figured out. And that's part of the beauty of it, right? Like the idea is that it's unfolding as you go. So in my case, I didn't know if I was going back to work. I didn't know if I was going to just become like a bike cycle instructor, all these things that I had. So I left room for the possibility, but I was back to that discipline and commitment. Like, I was committed to me, and I was committed to figuring out, like, what did I want? Because I clearly wasn't working for me the way things were going.
This is The Balance Dilemma. We're speaking with Rachael O'Meara about taking a pause. Rachel, can you quickly take us through the 5 signs that you may need a pause?
Yeah. So keep in mind, if you're listening to these, just track these real quickly in your mind, because even if you have one of these, a pause can be what you need. And again, it's an intentional shift in behavior. It doesn't mean a long pause. But the first sign is you used to love your job. Now you loathe it. The second sign is your boss tells you it's not working out. Maybe you get a negative performance review, or they ask you to look for another role or something like that. The third sign is maybe there's a technology intervention or some kind of third party who comes in to say, maybe you're spending too much time on those phones or technology, things like that. The fourth sign is you experience a major life shift or event. Maybe that's like a health crisis or a death in the family. Maybe it's moving, whatever it is. And the fifth sign is that you come across an opportunity that you want to explore, which leads to different possibilities.
So I was wondering, in your experience, is there a difference in men and women with regard to this pause mentality? Has one group responded better than the other?
That is probably a long debate we could have, because my sense is from the pausing standpoint, even as an aspect, it tends to be more aligned with the feminine value system, meaning men and women, everyone can have this, but women seem to be more attuned to it, meaning maybe we pause and hold space for people even, right? Just knowing how we feel. Those can all be intentional shifts in behavior. Men can easily pause as well. Sometimes if they're self-aware or doing things, they are well tuned in already. I find that more women have been receptive to this message, but I think it really covers everyone.
In your book, you talk about, as you're thinking about a pause, a sucky first draft. Can you tell us what that means?
Sucky first draft is a riff on Brene Brown's SFD. She calls it with a little more derogatory term, first draft, if you get what I mean. But really, it's the permission that you can give yourself an opportunity to write out a first draft of what you would do differently if you could. So it doesn't have to be perfect. You don't have to have all the details like we talked about, but it's really an opportunity to put it down on paper, at least maybe journaling like I mentioned or something, where you can actually then maybe have it go into motion from there, the first step.
Well, what's interesting about that is that Brene took that from Annie Lamott, who also used another word instead of sucky, but you get the point. So you've had a lot of emphasis in your book on what I coined DDP, Digital Device Pause. Now I've got, some acronym that I've coined using your verbiage. But tell us about that. What is it about digital devices that can lead us to the need of a pause, and how does that work into this whole conversation?
So if we think about our devices, do you think you're over-indexed or under-indexed when you look at your phone or anything, whether it's streaming media on TV and all of those social media apps, right? Typically, we are way over-indexed. In fact, even years ago, the stat was we check our phones 250 times a day. So we are clearly tethered to our devices. So a digital device pause, which is a DDP, is a type of pause, which is an intentional shift of behavior, potentially to shift your relationship with technology. So you might get a little less detached from checking your phone all the time. So you can create rules potentially around that for yourself, which is a really great way to start with boundaries. So maybe you decide, and even this might be a family decision, to not have technology at your dinner table every night, or tech-free Thursdays, or something like that. And there's a whole science behind this I'm not going to get into, but we're actually wired to be on our phones, and the reality is we have to take action to actually detach from them, and I think a DDP is a really great way to start. So
we have the same problem as our children, in other words.
Correct, yeah. It's all wired in as our brain is wired for that dopamine hit. Work a lot with neuroscience, and the reality is dopamine is a reward activity, and we want more of it. So, but you're actually wanting more naturally. It's nothing personal. We all are wired to check our phones as much as possible, believe it or not. So we have to take action to do something different. Otherwise, we're going to get stuck there, and that's just not what we all want to do, most likely.
So as you're looking into yourself as to what you want to do and why you might need a pause, what if you have a partner? Do you need your partner to have the same mindset or buy into this concept? Do you both pause at the same time, or is it better to do it at different times?
I'm curious to hear what your stories are, because I think we all have our own opinions about where we are in our world, right? And we're all different. But my sense is start with you, because you can be the example for your partner, and you probably, if you're listening to this or aware of pausing, could even bring it up as a discussion, as a conversation. What do you think about pausing? And then maybe there's some beliefs there, judgments, right? Like, oh, pausing's for slackers. What are you talking about? Like, I got to go back to work. So I think it's all about being curious, and I think it's great if you and your partner can have a discussion about it for starters, and then maybe you will discover you're on the same page, or maybe you'll discover you're not. But then from there, you can continue to have it as a healthy discussion, because I think we all need more pausing, intentional shifts in behavior in our lives so that we can reach our potential, so that we can be better leaders. And if we don't talk about it, if we're not really living it and incorporating it into our world, then chances are then it's not going to really become what we'd want it to become.
So in your book, you give examples, you tell the stories of a number of people who've taken pauses. But it appeared that your examples don't have children or are not otherwise caretakers. How can you take a pause with a family or other obligations? Because, frankly, you can't pause parenting, and it can be one of the greatest stressors as well as joys.
Of course. Yeah, and let me just say, I'm not a parent. I have nephews and nieces, but I know that that's something that I know a lot of caretakers struggle with, and I totally understand that. And I think what that means, and I've written articles on this in magazines and things like that, where even daily pauses can be a mental shift and literally a pause from the daily grind of even especially those early years of being a parent and a caretaker. So it starts with the choice. You have a choice to pause. It's not going to be maybe a really long pause, but how can you take care of you so that you can take care of your family? But we have to learn to take care of ourselves first. Otherwise, it's just not sustainable. And we're seeing that in the healthcare industry and medications and depression and therapy, all that stuff. So clearly we need to do things differently. And I think being a parent, you can be the example. You can help your child learn that you can be, which is pausing, and do as part of your daily life. And daily pauses are
I'm
great.
going to give you a little bit of a suggestion here. Maybe you're going to quote me once again, but periods of time, maybe it's an exercise class or a walk where we don't have our phone with us as caretakers, is really important so that we don't get burnt out. And
except you can't really do that if you're a caretaker.
Well, I think you can do it for an hour of exercise. And I have been in classes where one person in the room has a phone and she is a medical doctor. But when I see other people having the phone and they don't have an excuse, you're a better person to take a little bit of time. Maybe it can't be an hour. Maybe it could be a half an hour. But to do that, do not disturb for yourself just so you could take a breather. I think that that's something that could really help. So another category is age. Is it ever too late for a pause? A lot of your examples fell within the middle years of life. Not so much younger, not so much older. What do you think about later in life taking a pause?
It's never too late to pause. I don't think you can start young or old enough. I think it actually doesn't have to do with age, although I think we reach a certain set point, usually in middle of life, right? Midlife crisis, where we're like, wait a minute, what am I doing? So you could be in, third of life and decide maybe you go back to work. That is a pause. That's an intentional shift in behavior. It could be a risky conversation. If you're 90 and you've never talked about death with your family, that's a pause, in my opinion. Like these are aspirations that can literally shift how you think about things and then change how you do things, which is the power of pausing.
So there was a recent article, I think it was Forbes, about the Great Return, about older people who retired and left the workforce and are now returning. Could that be a pause where they, this is too much, I'm done with this, but they want to go back and do something, and they're starting to figure out what that is?
That's so good. Yes, I think so. Remember, a pause is an intentional shift in behavior. So why wouldn't it be if it's a choice and it feels really aligned? That's a key part of this, is what feels aligned for you. And if I want to go back to work after 20 years out, that could be very aligned. And that is me being in my truth of who I am becoming. To me, that would be a really good pause. And it doesn't mean you kick your feet up and don't do anything. I think that's a big misnomer of pausing. And I think it's about what works for you.
This is The Balanced Dilemma. And I'd like to let our listeners know where they can find us on the web at thebalanceddilemma.com, where you can listen to old episodes and sign up for our newsletter, find show announcements, show notes, resources, and further reading. Follow us on social media at The Balanced Dilemma Podcast on Facebook and LinkedIn. And if you want to email us and send us a note, tell us what you like, balanceddilemma@gmail.com. Episodes are also available for listening on Apple, iTunes, Google, and Spotify. Please share us, rate us. We appreciate it.
We're speaking with Rachael O'Meara about taking a pause. So Rachael, let's talk about after the pause. How do you return to a career? What was your reentry to Google or elsewhere like?
So I have a whole plan outlined in Pause the Book about how to communicate to others. And I think the first step is to actually just start practicing where you want to go, talking about maybe your experience, what you've done on your pause, what you've learned. That way it helps to normalize it again and helps bring other people along with you so that they can actually support you. If you maybe brush it off or be like, oh, I didn't do much, or oh, I didn't really think it was much of a big deal, no one else is going to think it's a big deal either. So for my standpoint, it's really important to have the intention to speak about what you've been doing so that you can help support yourself and that others will support you along with it. I think that's really key.
Did it help your career?
Oh, my whole career changed.
Right.
That's the beauty of a pause, is that you're in the unknown. So I did go back to Google. I worked there another 10 years. But I did have a new job. I moved into the sales department. I was no longer in client services. And I had a whole new experience there. And I also just, the way I did everything changed because I started studying new research on emotional intelligence, started doing a master's and a coaching certification. So everything can change, and that's the beauty of an intentional shift in behaviors. You never know where it's going to take you. But if you're open to being aligned and figuring it out while you pause, then that will be potentially what happens.
It's interesting that most of the examples in your book didn't seem to go back to their prior careers. What do you think of that? Did that surprise you?
Well, I think the reason why people burn out or why there is a pause in the first place is because you're not aligned. And there's something inside of you that you've cued into to say, hey, something doesn't feel good here. Let me figure that out. Let me decide what that is. And sometimes we need the space. And I like to say we need to create our space to find our truth. And so what happens is usually we realize, yeah, maybe that wasn't the best thing for me. Actually, I think this might be the best thing, whatever that might be. And it might be very slight. It doesn't need to be a big shift. You could, and I have a whole part of the book as well about how to stay in the same company or maybe go into a different role within a different company or the same company. But I think it's all about, again, what works for you. But if you don't have that understanding of tuning in, how will you ever know? And then just years go by, life goes by, and you are not happy, you're unsatisfied, and nobody wants to live like that. So why not just pause and do something different?
So how do you get around what I guess I would call established career lore, that it's easier to get a job when you already have a job? Is that still the case?
You know, it's a very interesting topic because I do think it's shifting, and I see that. Think of back to the parents. If there's people, potentially the moms, primary caretakers most likely, where you do take time off. It might be not just a normal maternity leave, it can be, but if it's longer, people are talking about that now. It's actually more normalized. So I think the more you can share your story, the better for that. And I don't think it's the same. I think if you come across as someone who's dedicated to knowing what you can do and have good skills in the workplace, why would you not want to be hired? And I think that's a valued skill at this point.
Well, this is something that's all part of this discussion with some of these commentators you touched upon, like Brene Brown, how we defeat imposter syndrome and have the confidence to re-enter and try new things. But the thing I really want to get to before we end the show is this project of yours. We've had many authors on this program or newly found entrepreneurs. Was it always your intention to write this book, or was this book the outgrowth of your experience?
Definitely the outcome of my experience. And like, think of it like the before and after. And maybe you can relate, where the before is like, oh, my God, I'm in crisis. Nothing's working. I'm a total failure. What am I going to do? Right? That's like the before.
Right.
Then you do something and you're in the unknown. You're like, okay, maybe it's not that bad. Maybe I could do something different. And then you come out of it. And then you're in this other area, which might be similar, might be totally different. We don't know, right? That's the other side of the pause. The idea is that when you come on the other side, my guess is the way you think is actually changed. You might have different thoughts, new beliefs, like things that are occurring to you that you didn't even have as insights earlier. And so that's what could be potentially the inspiration or something for the book. For me, I decided I can't be the only one who's burned out of corporate. I probably could share a couple of my tips that I've learned and help other people along the way. And that all came after I went back to Google.
So let's talk about the, we quoted Annie Lamott sort of here today. She's a really famous person who gives tips on writing, and, Bird by Bird is a great book she wrote. How did you write this book? Did you write it over what period of time did you write it? Why don't you tell us about that process?
So it took me 5 years. Bottom line, soup to nuts. I was working full time. And I spent most of my weekends dedicated to a couple hours at least, Saturday or Sunday, where I was working because I didn't have the mental bandwidth for anything outside of that. So it took me a while, and I just started it literally where I created a rule. If I was traveling for work, for business, on a plane, I would write. So I started pulling out my laptop, even if it was a 40-minute flight to L.A. from San Francisco or New York to Boston. Like, I was on that Word doc. And it didn't have an outcome. I wasn't determined and set to say, I'm going to have a book. But that was my dream. I was okay and knew if I just started this doc, if I just committed to the writing, and I can hold that vision for myself, I work a lot with vision, that it might become that. But maybe it's a blog. Maybe it's self-published. Like, I don't know how it will work. And
did you work with a writing coach?
I did, yeah. So I had several layers of this book, and the final layer was working with a writing coach. Her name is Holly Payne, and she helped make this book become what it is with putting the final touches in there and really helping this book become what it is now. And
when you got published, did you submit a proposal or did you submit a final product?
Proposal, just the traditional route. So literally going from the query letters to an agent to proposal to like shopping for a publisher, all of that happened.
Now, you had this wonderful opportunity to speak for TED. How did that come about?
Mm-hmm. So in 2019, so this was 2 years after the book came out, I'd been doing a lot of speaking and keynotes and on the stage, and one of my other visions was to really scale and help as many folks as I could. So I worked with another coach. I'm a big fan of coaches, if you didn't guess that. And I helped to potentially pitch myself to over 30-plus stages. And I did get TEDx talk in Fredericksburg, Virginia, that was all based on wellness. It really had to do with that theme, and that's how I got in.
Well, you are touching upon vocabulary. We love vocabulary. Let's be the teacher today, Maura. What do we need to know?
Well, I thought it was very interesting that a lot of what you discussed and the people that you cite are people who are in the mindfulness, I don't want to call it industry, but business, like Tara Brach and Radical Acceptance, the Name It to Tame It, with regard to your emotions and changing conversations in your head. If you could give a couple of tips of how people can do that, because it's very hard.
Sure. Yeah. I cite so many of my mentors and people I've studied in my master's in transformation. Tara Brach is amazing. I've done a lot of work myself in meditation and mindfulness, which is how this started and led me to where I'm at now. So one of the aspects, I think, is to really, even if you don't consider yourself a meditator, that's okay. Again, a pause is what works for you. But just to get quiet with yourself, right? Just to, whether that's writing or walking out in nature where you are present, right? So you're maybe knowing how you feel in the moment. To me, that's a really powerful skill, one of the most profound skills we have, and yet no one really can do that. We're not taught how to know how we feel, really, right? So that's one thing. I have a technique called TASER I talk about, which is based on a bunch of these individuals who have expert advice. But TASER is a acronym for really tuning in, aligning, shifting, expressing, and then repeating that if we are noticing that we're not okay in the moment. We feel maybe a little triggered or we're feeling a little out of whack.
And you have one more. This is an interesting name for it. Mental flossing.
I'm a big flosser, a dental flosser, okay? So that's where that came from. And I flossed this morning. But the idea is, what if you could, get in there in your brain with, literally a piece of floss and get the gunk out of the little, our brain is a 3 pounds, actually, of mass. And if we were able to, literally get the gunk out, just like we do with our teeth.
Rachel,
all I mean by that is getting the gunk out. Yeah.
We're going to have to wrap it up, but we have to ask you our theme question. Can you have it all and all at the same time?
Yes, and also have to prioritize.